Good evening. My name is Stephen Woolfolk. I'm the Director of Programming and Marketing for the Kansas City Public Library. And tonight we launch a new series on the future of work in Kansas City and across the country. The American workplace has undergone a lot of changes in my lifetime and certainly in yours. Sometimes those changes are driven by government, as with the creation of the federal minimum wage in 1933 and the establishment of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration in 1971. Sometimes they are driven by the private sector, as with the introduction of computers in the 1970s, and more recently with the use of social media as an alternative to traditional marketing and networking. But every once in a while, change comes from the ground up. Workplace dress codes, for example, were relaxed largely because American workers simply stopped following them. Rarely, though, have we seen a grassroots effort to revolutionize the workplace like we've seen in the last year. To be sure, not everyone is on board, but the number of people fighting for higher salaries and more flexibility is really quite astonishing. And they appear ready to back it up, as nearly 39 million Americans have quit their jobs so far this year. Tonight, we're joined by Kaleem Clarkson, the Chief Operating Officer of BlendMe Inc, a remote employee experience consultancy that helps startups and small businesses onboard, engage, and retain their remote teams. With nearly 20 years of strategic operations experience, he helps leadership implement people operations solutions that increase productivity and engagement for both internal and external stakeholders. He's passionate about work-life integration and maximizing the remote employee experience. Kaleem, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Stephen. I really appreciate it. It's been awesome. It's cool. Shout out to the Kansas City Chiefs, although I'm a Bears fan, but you got to do it.
Well, your Bears passed up on Patrick Mahomes. That's got to still hurt, right?
It definitely does. Thank you. Thanks again, Steve. Thanks again. Stephen, sorry.
Either one is fine. So I want to start out by asking you about the origin of your company, BlendMe Inc. Can you tell us a little bit about how that started?
Yeah, it's just really interesting how times go by so fast. I think I got my first experience with the idea of being just remote in college. I went to college in 90. I don't want to date myself too much, but 96 to 99, and during that time, I wanted to be a rock star, Stephen. I wanted to be a rock star, and got a chance to play some rock concerts. I created a charity called Concerts for Charity, and we got to work with a bunch of great artists. Did a documentary with Trey Anastasio from Fish, Dave Matthews Band, Bela Fleck and the Flecktones. It was really cool, man. It's really cool. So in my previous life, I thought that that's what I was going to do. Nonprofit management was what I wanted to study in school. Writing grants, social entrepreneurship, that was kind of like my first love. And with Concerts for Charity, we decided to do this tour of bands. We were on this tour called the Warp Tour, and we started recruiting people virtually. And we started recruiting volunteers to help us out virtually. And this is, again, 1999, 2000, between 99 and 2003. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you remember this website called Volunteer Match. Is it still rocking around?
Volunteer I do not recall that. I do not recall that.
Yeah, Volunteer Match was an unbelievable website where nonprofits, you had to be a nonprofit to be a member. And you could find volunteers, and you put job applications out. Some are paid positions, some are not. And we put it out on Volunteer Match. We got like over 2,000 applicants. Couldn't even believe it. Now, obviously, going to concerts is a pretty cool gig. Doing some work virtually or something. So I kind of stumbled upon that. And we actually ended up previewing a documentary called Action at HBO. So I have an IMDb credit from college. That's kind of cool. But anyway, fast forward to 2010. I'm originally from Maine. Mm-hmm. At that time I was going to college in Massachusetts, and my partner and I decided to move to Atlanta in 2008, and she ended up graduating from the University of Connecticut with her master's degree in human resources organizational development. So, she ended up doing her master's thesis on virtual volunteerism, and that's really where the research began. She saw that we were able to, bring together hundreds of people virtually, and that's what she did her thesis on. And then she's looking for jobs. And at that time, again, this is 2010, VP of people, director of people, those positions didn't exist. CHROs, chief human resources officers. So I was at that time training to kind of be a web developer, front end engineer. I fly out to Denver and I hear this guy named Matt Westgate give a talk at an event called DrupalCon Denver in 2012. And he's talking about how his company is a fully distributed company. And I'd never heard that term. I didn't actually know what he meant. And he's showing pictures, and mind you, he's the CEO of a company called BlendMe, and that company at that time, their clients are the Grammys, Grammys and what is it, MarthaStewart.com, and I think they redid Georgia.gov. So they do some pretty big sites, right? And he said, well, we didn't want to be a virtual company because we don't want our clients to think that we're not real. And we don't want to use the word remote because we don't want our employees to feel distant from each other. And he's showing these pictures of them all over the country, like where they're working at the Grand Canyon with their laptops. And mind you, we had just moved from Atlanta, from Maine. And if for people who've moved from the cold climate to the warm climate, you always feel like you're on vacation. Always. We've been here 15 years. I feel like I've been on vacation. And so I'm seeing all these pictures of people all over the country working, and he's showing pictures of his retreat. They hosted an annual retreat in Florida where they flew everyone there. And the faces and the quotes from his employees and how happy they were, and the idea that, could we go home to Maine and see our friends and family every summer? Because who doesn't want to go to vacation land in the summertime? So that was just fascinating. So on the plane ride back, I do what any good person does and starts doing research. I even think I might have gone to the Fulton County Public Library to find some more research on stuff, and just started diving in, started reading books. Remote or Rework by Jason Fried and DHH from Basecamp was the first book I read in 2013. That was a very, very kind of, a lot of people consider that the remote work kind of Bible. Then The Year Without Pants, which is another great book, The 4-Hour Work Week, and so on. And then come 2013, I approached my partner and said, hey, why don't we start our own employee engagement consulting firm? I can do all of the website stuff. I had been a director of operations and strategic initiatives for a higher ed faculty development center for a long time, so I knew how to package programs. Our supervisor had let us telecommute for years. And, my partner, she had worked for a company called Elevon, which was fully remote. And so we were exposed to her for a while. We incorporated our company in 2013 as a side hustle, having fun with it. Being very selective. I think the first thing we said is we don't want to be able to we don't want to work with companies who are not culture driven, so we're very selective. Then fast forward to 2019, I'm a full-time engineer, and pandemic hits 2020. I'm a full-time engineer for a fully remote company out of Providence, Rhode Island. Had a great experience there, learned a lot, worked on a lot of big projects, some Ohio State projects, some Blue Cross Blue Shield projects. And then eventually the pandemic hit. And sure enough, people started calling saying all the same thing. Like, you guys have been doing this since 2013. You're going to be very successful. So that's the whole story, kind of from the beginning till now.
So you touched on this a little bit, but there was kind of a perception that remote work movement kind of popped out of nowhere as a result of the pandemic. And certainly it wasn't thriving like it is now, but there were signs that that movement was alive back in 2013, right?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. So I think that's probably, there are a lot of misconceptions going on, of course, but that's one of the biggest things. I noticed when I would tell people back then, we're going to consult with companies that work remotely. They'd look at me like, people work from home? Sure they do. Like, sure they work from home. But we always tried to pay, when we started doing the research, we found an individual named Jack Nillis. And I'm really kind of geeked up because we actually connected today on LinkedIn. So I'm kind of starstruck. But this man was a engineer, a rocket engineer in the late 60s or something like that. And then he ended up doing some research or going to a university after he did that. And he did some research, and he was living in LA, I believe, out in the California area, in the traffic. He was noticing the traffic. And he actually coined the phrase, I believe in I want to say 72, roughly. Yeah, 72. He coined the phrase telework. He coined the phrase telework, the idea of working. And it's funny because we actually had the definition on our website for the longest time. And someone was like, yo, that looks so outdated, because it's funny. It's kind of like if you can work by email, fax, and, any other, what did he say? Internet connected device or something weird like that. So yeah, remote work has been around a long time. Whether you want to use the definition, I think that's where we're getting lost today, is there's so many different definitions. But yeah, it's been around a long time. And really, I learned a lot of my expertise from the Drupal community, which is an open source web development tool, very similar to WordPress. And a lot of the development companies were already full-time remote. So this is absolutely nothing new. If you do some research out there, just Google flex jobs rate of growth. I believe the stat is something like, and don't quote me, I probably should have been prepared with the stat specifically, but it's something like remote work growth from 1995 all the way until even the recession, the first financial crisis, had an increase of like 3 or 4% every year. And then in the last 10 years, even before the pandemic, it was something like a 20% increase.
Wow.
So remote work has been increasing more and more. It just makes sense. I mean, we all know. So yeah, it's definitely not something that is new. Organizations have already excelled at it for over 15 and 20 years. Some organizations have won best places to work. So this is something that is far from new.
At the risk of jumping too far ahead, because we're going to circle back after this, but do you believe that this movement was inevitable, or I guess the movement was already in place, but do you think that the Great Resignation or the grassroots movement for this mass shift was inevitable, regardless of whether or not the pandemic had happened?
Yeah, absolutely. That's Steve. That's a great question. And to answer your question in short, yes. My projection was something like, I think everyone will be remote by like 2035 or something. I was looking at it, and because things were going at a very slow pace, but people were doing it a lot more. There's no doubt that there would have been a tipping point. Technology, human wants and needs and stuff, we're all heading that way. People are tired of the commutes. Commutes are getting. I live in Atlanta, and one of the top 5 longest commutes in the country. I think at one point it was number 1. These things were just already starting to happen. Government was very flexible, and that's the other thing. Like with Jack Nillis, the term telework is a government term. That's what the government uses. So it's already been in place for a long time. So it was it was definitely something that was gonna happen, but by no means at the speed and the acceleration that we're at now. By not even close, I don't think.
So it's 2013 when you start BlendMe, and then the pandemic happened 7 years later. What were some of the biggest roadblocks that you faced in those first 7 years?
Really just the perception that remote work isn't for everyone and can't be done. Now, let me rewind and do the caveat. I feel like a lot of times, especially in 2021, you have to be so specific because you would hope that people have common sense. But I think a flight specialist, a remote pilot, maybe remote pilot someday, But there's certain jobs that's not going to happen. A cashier, it's a cashier. So yes, remote work isn't necessarily for everyone. But outside of those jobs, I think I've seen something like knowledge working jobs account for a good amount of percentage. If you work with a computer, I believe Laurel Farr and she's from Distribute Consulting. She's been everywhere. If you Google remote work article, she's probably going to be in it. She has this cool little definition, and I'm definitely going to mess it up. But I think she says if you use a computer 75 or 80% of the time, your job can be fully remote.
That seems about right.
And I was just like, wow, that's pretty simple. Like if you're on the computer, because basically that's what's getting you the information. That's how you're completing task. If you have to complete task more than 80% of the time, you can be remote. So.
In my research today, I came across this interesting interview that Arthur C. Clarke did with BBC in 1964. He was, of course, a science fiction author, and he was making predictions about what the world would be like in 2014. And he came up with these things that must have seemed so far-fetched at the time, that there would be wireless communication that would allow you to be in touch with somebody instantly at any time.
What year was the book?
The interview took place in 1964.
Oh my gosh, right out of the Batman comics.
Yeah. And by 2014, he predicted there would be robotic surgery. And all of these things came true, except for the one thing that he might have missed on was he predicted that the commute to work would no longer happen by 2014. He basically thought by that time, the only reason people would drive would be if they were for their own entertainment, their own choice. But he actually came pretty close. Maybe, it seems like, right?
I mean, we're probably still some distance from what he was describing right there. Like nobody will commute.
Right.
Because I think one thing that we have to be very careful of is, we are definitely a species that is a prisoner of the moment, should we say. We love being in the moment and we forget about yesterday and we don't think about tomorrow, So there are reasons to go to the office. As a remote work advocate, we need spaces to come together. Now, if you want to call those offices, if you want to call those conference centers, if you want to call those connection centers, I think I've seen innovation spaces. I've heard different terms on it. Whatever you want to call it, we are a tribal species. Mm-hmm. So, we're not the the hedgehog. I learned that watching cartoons with my daughter. The hedgehog is a isolate species, a species that can be by themselves. What's it called? Anyway, we are a tribal species. We can't be by ourselves. So I think he was right. I mean, not right. He guessed something, but I still think we are, I don't know, probably 15 years away. Okay. I think we accelerated it a lot, but I mean, we're seeing a lot of CEOs,
they aren't quite ready yet.
Yeah.
So COVID-19 comes out of nowhere, and everything went from full speed ahead to a near complete shutdown, like literally overnight in a lot of cases. And employers are suddenly faced with this choice, figure out how to do remote work or decide to not do business anymore. Mm-hmm. And I would guess that your personal feelings were probably similar to those of everyone else who suddenly found themselves cut off from family, friends, and the daily routine. But from a professional standpoint, how long did it take for you to start to see this as an opportunity, not just for your business, but for the remote work movement?
You're talking about seeing the pandemic as an opportunity for the remote work movement? Immediately. As soon as the schools closed, as soon as they said all public schools are closed, I was like, this is it. This is the beginning. And of course, we were already months behind from China and Europe. So seeing that information from there, it's like, this is going to be the biggest case study on remote work. It's a global case study at that. You have countries that don't have all the big four and all the big consulting companies are probably spending so much money in research right now, mm-hmm. because the amount of research that's going to come from this in years to come is going to be vast. How did companies with slow internet do during right now? What did they do to overcome? Because everyone had to overcome. And I feel like that is the big ticket for this, this pandemic. You had no choice. Restaurants had no choice. They had to do takeout. They had to figure that out. So from that perspective, I just kind of feel like we're definitely moving forward, and I'm just really happy, honestly. I feel like this is what the remote work space kind of needed to prove to non-believers. Believers were already there, but to prove to the non-believers and even the individuals who as employees, like, I'd really like to do this, but I don't dare to ask my boss.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So this is definitely the biggest experiment, and I can't wait to see what comes out of all the research from all the different countries, sexes, genders, social economic statuses. I mean, there's so much to kind of dig into.
I would assume that you were contacted by quite a few people when all of this started. And I would also guess that there were some people that had no interest in remote work as a long-term solution, that were probably just in touch with you saying, look, I just need to figure out how to do this until we can get everybody back in the office. Is that true? Did you get some folks like that?
No, we didn't. We didn't. I think we're pretty good with our verbiage. I mean, we pretty much just say, if you're not working with one of these three models, and we kind of break down telework. So there's different types of telework. See, we're using Jack Nils's term. So there's different types of remote work. And I think that that's the challenge, that there's these terms and they mean something different to everybody else.
Right.
So we were lucky in the fact that even back then we just said, look, if remote work, if you're not interested and you're not in it, then we don't want to work with you. I think there are a lot of companies that are like that are trying to kind of satisfy people for now.
Yep.
But I think there's been enough research and enough polls and enough support data saying that this is just the beginning. Hybrid remote. So let me go back to the different types of remote work, because it's important to kind of have context of what we're talking about, which is really the biggest challenge, I think, in the industry. So remote work, you have this spectrum. And on the far, we'll just say on one far end, we have fully remote, what we call fully remote or fully distributed. All the way to the left, you have no office and you can work from wherever, whenever you want, generally. So just get the work done. That's the most flexible you can be. All the way to the right, and we're staying within remote work. We're not saying to the right is zero. All the way to the right is what we would put as telecommute. And telecommute is what we've been used to in the government, where you're required to work in the office a majority of the work week, plain and simple. You have to go into the office, sit down at least 3 days a week, a majority of the work week. So that could be, you can work from home 1 day a week, but you have to go to the office the majority. In the middle, that's where everyone's talking about hybrid remote. And it's the most confusing because you can have so many variations of this. And really, the hybrid remote is like a combination of the two, right? Like hybrid remote is, companies have a centralized workplace. And a lot of these things are kind of like based around a centralized workplace. So fully distributed, there is no centralized workplace. And telecommute, employees are required to commute to a centralized workplace the majority of the work week. In a hybrid remote setting, companies have a centralized workplace where some employees commute while others work remotely. So that definition is really vague because that could be you go in twice a month. That could be 90% of the company has to go into the office 8 to 5, but 10% are fully remote. So those are kind of the different types of remote. And companies who reached out to us, they were one of those three. So no, we didn't really kind of get those situations that you were talking about.
So we know now that the pandemic, of course, dragged on a little longer than I think most of us anticipated it was going to. And companies have been operating with this remote work to some degree or another for nearly 2 years now. I know you just mentioned that it'll be interesting to see what comes out of this, what we learn. But what's your sense right now? How do you think this has worked out in the sense of productivity? Is it up? Profits, are they up? Are companies winning?
Yeah, definitely. Companies are definitely winning. I mean, kind of house rules, right? House always wins. But I was talking to someone about this the other day. If the requirement back to the office requirement is very challenging for me, and the reason that is because if we weren't successful or productive, we'd be in the office wearing hazmat suits.
Yeah.
I'm gonna use a little slang. Don't trip. Don't get it twisted, okay? Don't get confused that, our well-being is the most important thing in this thing. That is, that's cash rules everything around me, the great Wu-Tang. And basically, if we were not productive, we would be in the office with hazmat suits. But the reality of the situation is a lot of companies are more productive right now. A lot of companies are more productive. People aren't doing that chit chat. So it's going to be very, very, very difficult for an executive in leadership to say, you've been working for 2 years. You've hit all of your numbers. Maybe you've hit more of your numbers. You've been happier. But I'm going to need you to come into the office because this thing called culture is taking a hit. No data, by the way, to support. No data. No data to say that our culture scores were this before, because most likely these companies were not measuring the culture and employee engagement, and the employee experience most likely was not a top priority. If a company had all these stats prior to the pandemic and then we're showing stats post-pandemic, believe it, that would be on the front of every newspaper right now. Every big company would be pushing that research. Every big company would be behind it because they want people back into the office. But we haven't seen that. And that's because productivity is high.
So we ended up with a lot of companies that were kind of scrambling to figure out how to accommodate essential employees and non-essential employees, those who had jobs that could be remote, those who did not. And employees who were deemed essential, sometimes they got paid, and others that were not faced furloughs. How did you recommend companies deal with kind of that fairness issue with the people that could do remote work and those who couldn't?
Yeah, that is Steve, I think that's probably the toughest part about this work. Because at the end of the day, we kind of started off at the beginning. At the end of the day, there are jobs that cannot be done remotely. It cannot be done. So in those situations, the thing that we advise companies is really to just provide the most transparent process as possible. So trust, we have this thing, it's not everyone has this, but Blend, we came up with this framework, which we call TREE, the remote employee experience. And the two main principles are trust and responsibility. The employee experience has been plenty of research. It's great. Gallup has a great process. We use it. But we were trying to think about, what's different about the remote employee experience? And really, employers have to start with trust. Not trust is earned. You have to start. Trust has to be assumed. Like, you have to start with trust because you're not seeing the people. And then responsibility. The organization has to be responsible. So for us, we advise these organizations to be as transparent as possible, even transparent with salaries. I mean, I'm assuming you're a library employee, so your salary's public. Yep. I stayed in government for 12 years. My salary was always public, and heck, there's in the government's the U.S.'s largest employer, so therefore the largest employers, all the salaries are public. There's a company called Buffer where they do a great state of remote work. They're one of the best. Shout out to Buffer. They are kind of one of the grandfathers of this salary transparency, where they post everyone's salary and how much they're going to earn, stock options and everything. And the idea is that transparency is the source of truth. It's the ultimate source of trust. So what we advise is do a true assessment of each position. Do a true assessment, an unconscious bias. Have multiple people do this assessment. Let the person who's in the job do the assessment as well. And if this job cannot be done remotely, it needs to be documented. You got to have, a hybrid remote we're calling it either a remote handbook or a hybrid remote handbook, whichever remote work model that you're going to use. You need to document what remote work means to your company and what positions can do it. Once that's established, even if you're doing it now for the first time, yes, there's going to be some emotion attached to it. There are going to be some challenges that you're going to have to work through. But being transparent, being inclusive in the process, including employees in that decision making, that's going to be important. But there are things that you can do for even those employees, though. So, and I think this is where we're getting at. So let's use let's use any type of position. I don't know. Let's go with the prison guard. You know, when that person has to call out sick, are there some tasks, some paperwork that person can do? There are generally some things, even from a construction worker who's doing cement. They have to fill out reports. There's some things that could be done potentially.
Pay them to do professional development from home, maybe.
Thank you. There are some things we don't have to be put down here. I have a dentist appointment. That's a prime example. Do you have sick time? I mean, I've been working this hard for you, pouring this cement for X amount of years, making you X amount of dollars, and you're gonna make me use an hour for my doctor's appointment. So that's the type of advice that we advise to companies who need to kind of classify these positions, because there's different positions that can work remotely. You also have different challenges working with hourly employee versus exempt. There's different challenges there. So the biggest piece of advice, and we're not attorneys, we do have a law firm that we are partners with to help with these types of things, but it's all about transparency and inclusivity in the decision making.
I'm going to jump out of order here for a little bit because you brought up trust. And I listened to a previous interview with you, and most people, when they think about trust, they immediately go to, the employer, can they or can they not trust the employee to work when they're at home? But you say that the trust is important, a culture of trust, but it's on both sides. How does trust play into this from the employer perspective?
Yeah, like that's a great point. So both trust and the responsibility, the two pillars that we talk about on the remote employee experience, we look at it as kind of like a reciprocal thing. It's like a relationship going back and forth. So with trust, the employer, we talked about, the employer has to trust the employee that they're going to get the job done. But the employee has to trust the employer that they're going to follow through on what they've already articulated for the employee value proposition that maybe they applied to, that they're going to follow through in providing all of the resources. They're interested in your professional development, your career. Like the employees, especially right now, you're talking about, like, you want to talk about a market. This employee is really trusting you because they could go somewhere else very quickly. They're really trusting the employer that they're going to follow through on what they've seen from that company that attracted them to apply. So yeah, that trust is reciprocal. And then the responsibility, the other letter, now you were talking about trust, but the other letter, the responsibility, it's the employer's responsibility to ensure that everyone in that company has all of the resources that they need to get the job done, right? They need to ensure that that's correct. They need to ensure that, they understand the policies and they've been on board. The onboarding process is set up for remote teams, and that they plan retreats, that they're going to provide opportunities for social connection because you're remote. That's the responsibility on the employer. Well, on the employee side, you have to be responsible in getting your job done, getting your task done. But you also have to be responsible for asking questions, raising your hand, writing documentation, helping other people. Because if you don't ask questions, if you're not candid with feedback, if you're not providing these things to the organization, then all of the resources that they kind of provided you kind of go to waste. So it's definitely those two things, trust and responsibility, are a reciprocal relationship between the employer and employee.
Thank you. Yeah. So once the stay-at-home orders were lifted, there was a lot of uncertainty about what the next steps were going to be. Some companies couldn't wait to get everybody back to work in the office quick as possible. Others started to kind of phase in a return. Some people probably decided they were going to stick with remote work indefinitely. What were some of the best and worst practices you saw, setting aside the idea of not necessarily rushing everybody back, but in terms of the way businesses were thinking about how to proceed? What mistakes do you think that they made that led them to this, we got to have everybody back?
Yeah, so on one side, the best thing, I feel like the companies that have done the best. So let's just clarify the companies that we're talking about. So companies that were forced into working remotely due to the pandemic, just to kind of, for our listeners, we'll talk about these companies here, right? And then trying to decide when to come back is what we're talking about, right? Mm-hmm. The ones that did this very well were the ones that said, you know what, we have no idea. We don't know.
Yeah.
And guess what? You're not going to have to come back until we do know. And we will let you know well in advance as soon as that time is. But until this pandemic, until the risk of, and I think, unfortunately, we're tying remote work to COVID right now, which is a very unfortunate thing for the remote work industry. But at the same time, it is kind of pretty effective. So the organizations that were like, you know what, don't worry, don't stress. You're not going to have to come back to the office until this thing is completely gone, until it's 100% safe to come back to the office. To me, that's just being humble. To me, that's just having empathy, being honest. We don't know. We have this expensive office building and we have no idea, you know. Those companies, I feel like their employees are the happiest. Well, let's just say in the middle. The ones that are happiest are the ones that are just like, you know what, you never have to come back to the office.
Yeah.
So let me rephrase. The ones who are doing it the best were just like, don't worry, we're done with the office. You come in, you do whatever, you no longer have to do the office. As far as like the ones that want people to come back and they're not sure what to do yet, the ones who said, we don't know, don't worry about it. You don't have to come back until everything's safe. So those are the ones that are good examples. Bad example, we'll use Apple, we'll use Google, we'll use all the big companies, Goldman Sachs, the ones that said, well, you know what, everyone's coming back to the office on this date. That is the worst thing that you can do. Right now, everyone's very upbeat because there's a high level, a lot of vaccinations right now, but the cases are not lower than they were last year at this time.
Right.
It's almost like we've become numb to the number of cases, right? Like because they were so high at one point, they're down now, we're okay. But let me tell you, if we have a tough winter again, which is possible.
Could be, yeah.
Right? That is going to extend it again. And for some companies, that's telling people, what, 5 times now or 4 times now on a deadline? That is not how you want to communicate. During times of uncertainty, that is not how you want to communicate to your employees. You want to give your employees some anxiety, keep changing the date.
Yeah. I wonder if the
date.
Facebook just did that again, I think this week, right? They delayed their return. But what struck me was even when they were delaying their return, the way it was worded was, we are delaying the mandatory return to the office. And just that word mandatory tacked onto that just sent shivers down my spine.
It really did. It really did. It's really unfortunate because, I mean, it's just coming down to, like, I'm just curious, Steve. I'm just going to flip the mic around. I'm curious. I'm going to ask you, like, what logical reason would a leader have to require everyone back to the office?
The only one I can imagine is if they don't believe that their employees are doing the work from home, even though all of the productivity numbers, all of the profit numbers, the Wall Street numbers, everything would suggest that it's happening. It would appear somebody still doesn't believe that people are working as hard as they would if they were at their desk.
But how is that the case, though, if you're hitting all the numbers? That doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't at all, no.
So to me, I think it's about cost and investment. And that's real estate, baby. That's real estate.
Yeah, okay.
You know, at the beginning of this pandemic, I don't know if anyone remembers, it kind of seems like, geez, it's 20 years ago now, right? It's only been like, 20 months or something. But I want to say around April of 20, roughly. I could be off on this. Pinterest, they had an office in downtown San Francisco that they were leasing. They broke their lease for $91 million. Wow. Listen to that number, people. Pinterest broke their lease for $91 million because they said, we're not doing this anymore. They realized, now they didn't own I'm assuming they didn't own the building. Yeah, they broke their lease, so they didn't own the building. They realized that it's a sunk cost. I can't get that back.
Yeah.
So you know what? I'm going to cut my losses and just say we've already paid for it. It's over. So what I feel like, I'm in Atlanta, and we have some great companies that moved to Atlanta. We have Mercedes-Benz corporate moved to Atlanta. State Farm moved their corporate offices to Atlanta, built brand new, huge skyscrapers. They literally opened, I want to say in like November of 19. They've been empty this whole time.
Wow.
So what are they going to do? I believe Nike built this crazy, like the LeBron James office, like their campus is like this crazy $1 billion campus. And I'm just throwing out numbers. I have no idea. Google it yourself, find the numbers. But what are they going to do? You know, you're building these huge, crazy campuses. These are investments that you were using to attract employees to your place, and now they're just empty. So for me, Steve, I feel like a lot of this comes down to investment, real estate, and obviously control. But I think if people could get out of their leases for free, I don't think we would be seeing a lot of required back to the offices as much.
Yeah. And now that you mentioned that, I suspect that you might be right, because it occurs to me a lot of these tech companies that are the ones that are kind of leading the charge on the back to the office, they're the same companies that built these mega campuses just in the last 5, 6 years, 10 years.
Right. Like Google built an environment where they took care of every single like decision that you had to make to be more productive, like daycare, laundry, food. Let's just provide all that for you so you don't have to worry about just crank out the work. Well, now what?
Yeah. I've got some audience questions that have come in, but I want to ask something else first here, because you brought this up. How does trust play in at this point? Because it seems to me an employer that is making these decisions about what's going to happen with remote work, who doesn't bother to consult their employees about what they think that policy should be, that's not really starting from a position of trust, is it?
No. I am just so shocked that Apple didn't do this. These companies are very smart. They lead in every space: people operations, technology, human, research, like yourself. They're all leading in every space. How in the world? Why? I want to know why. I would love to interview the VP of People Operations at Apple. What was the reason for you not doing what we do as a consultancy? Why did you not bring in a third-party perspective? Why did you not let that third party interview your employees, send out surveys, and involve them in a change management initiative that would result in a report that all your employees have put kind of their heart on and their statistics, and then you make the decision. Regardless of what decision you would have made then, at least you could have given a reason as to what your decision was. We've gotten all your research. We've heard what you've had to say. You've had some great concepts, but we need to go in this direction because of A, B, and C. Now, the big thing is if you didn't have A, B, and C, and that was the reason why you didn't want to do it, and you just wanted to do it for no reason, then maybe that's why it hasn't happened, Steve. I mean, I don't know why. That's how we're being hired. That's why companies are bringing us in. You want a third party perspective when you're talking about people's preferences and their wants and the challenges of how work was being done before and challenging the status quo. Yeah, have somebody else come in. That's what consultants are for.
Absolutely. I'm going to switch gears here, ask a couple of audience questions.
Let's do it.
Somebody wants to know, what are the tax implications of working remotely? I know that's a tough one to answer, but I think the second part might be a little easier for you. I'm a freelance writer and I'm unable to write off my computer because it isn't in a separate room. That doesn't seem right.
Huh? That doesn't. So I'm not 100% sure on tax law, but basically if you have an LLC, you say you're a freelance writer, you have an LLC, purchase the laptop with your LLC. That to me, that's just, I guess I don't understand. Like to me, that's just an expense for a product. So I guess if you don't have an LLC and you're using a different work computer, that's probably different. But yeah, get an LLC and you should be able to purchase that through your LLC, and it's an expense.
Okay. Here's another one. Has the pandemic moved businesses toward more automation and artificial intelligence, lowering reliance on the human workforce?
Ooh, this is a good one. This is a good one. Let's give this a yeah. Whoever Steve, Mr. Weiberg, make sure you give this one a gold star. Whoever asked that question. That is something that we have not. So one thing that I firmly believe in is like for every action there's a reaction, and for every good thing there's a bad thing. There's a bad side to it as well.
Right.
And AI and automation, a lot of companies were like, hey, we need to be more efficient because we got to figure this thing out. And now they're more open to technology. Yes, I think that's a legit risk. I think we're in a difficult position as a species, I think, because the technology that we're coming up with is pretty far out. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
We're talking about, do you go into space like as just a fun trip? I mean, who would have thought that? Like my mom's asking my mom that, seeing the landing of the moon. So yes, I do believe as a species, we're going to have to rethink what work is like, what work is. If we can create technologies that do the mundane for us, things that we used to think, like, for example, cursive. Can people write cursive still? I try to every once in a while just to see if I can do it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But like we're progressing, self-driving cars. What happens when self-driving cars are mastered? What does that mean? Does that mean taxi drivers are done? I mean, you're in the library industry. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about that in Amazon. How I mean, the whole industry, the whole space has transformed. We were talking about that the other day of what public libraries do today and what they're used for, and I learned a ton about that.
Yeah.
So yes, I think it's the pandemic has definitely accelerated the openness to technology. We haven't even talked about kind of like the Bitcoin stuff, like transactions, people playing the stock market, younger kids playing the stock market and short and stuff. Everything is definitely lowering the reliance on like humans actually pushing the button.
Sure.
Yes, 100%.
This is another really good audience question. What can employees do if their workplace doesn't feel like a safe place to ask questions, and or if employers don't follow through, especially in providing resources for remote work?
Ooh, yes. That's another good one. So, this is where it's either going to tip in the employee's favor or it's going to tip into the employer's favor. And the question is going to be whether employees are willing to say enough is enough. And it seems like right now, based on the statistics, like I heard in the intro when we were talking about the Great Resignation, seems like right now the employees are saying enough is enough. I'll figure out a way to survive. And I think everybody's, I think with as much unfortunate deaths we've had over the past 2 years, people are looking at their lives differently. So to answer your question, the first thing that you need to do is start small. Approach your boss, approach your supervisor very small, and say, "Hey, look, we're gonna do this a couple times a week. We're gonna try this, and you have to follow through. You have to crush it. You have to be able to say, hey, I'm gonna do this task. Unfortunately, it's been a long time already. So like going through this typical exercise that I would tell people to, like right now, like in 2021 in December, I would say, look, if you haven't proven that you can work remotely already, it's time to start looking. plain and simple. Like it's scary for some people. But the reality is do you want workplace flexibility or not? Some people are not going to come out of this believing in this. And what needs to happen is employees need to, in order for this to have a lasting impact, those people have to feel the results of not wanting to adapt. So I would say, look, if you've already tried, it's been almost 2 years. So what other proof could you probably provide now that you could provide, moving forward?
Is it worth it asking that question? Just scheduling a meeting with your boss and just saying, look, I felt like I've done a good job. I've been productive. I've done all of the work you've given me. What else do I need to show you to believe that this can be done?
100. Oh yes, absolutely. Have the conversation. But I think the question was if they're not willing.
Yeah, if they're not following up.
Yeah, it seems like they've had that if you haven't had that conversation. So to rewind, if you haven't had that conversation, Steve is absolutely correct. You got to have that conversation. You have to say, hey, look, it's been X amount of days, X amount of hours. I've been doing this since, March of 20, and I'm crushing it. I'm doing good. And even if you're not doing like the same 100% exact level, like just look at it from a perspective of, well, how many days have I been out sick? Most likely you haven't taken any days sick. So just that alone, if you were just a little bit below performing what you were doing before and you weren't sick at all, because you're working remotely, that you're evening yourself out. So it's like, have that conversation. And if they're not willing to bend at this point, it's time to start looking.
I do want to touch on the Great Resignation as we're starting to run out of time here. There is another misperception in all of this. Seems to be that the Great Resignation is actually people who were drawing unemployment, and that was why they decided that they don't want to work because they'd rather just draw the unemployment check.
Right.
Any truth at all to that?
Let me say that there's some truth to people being fed up with low wage jobs and looking at the math and saying, why do I want to go and work at XYZ job, be exposed? I think that's a lot of things that people aren't considering, and get paid almost nothing when I could take some unemployment and go home. So I have to acknowledge that there are those situations. But the Great Resignation, when you look at 20 million people quitting their jobs, and I had to just make sure that I was 100% right on this, because I've always been like, well, bro, I don't think you can get unemployment if you quit your job. You know what I mean? I think you have to either be, you have to be let go. Like, that's how I always thought about that.
There are some circumstances, but as a general rule, yeah.
There are some. And sure enough, national employment law, dude, looked it up. Yeah. People who quit their jobs generally can't collect unemployment. So just based on that, and of course, you're going to say, oh, I know Jimmy down there, he quit. Yes, there's always going to be some people who game the system a little bit, but general rule of thumb, no, not on the numbers. 20 million people have quit since April of 21. Yeah. That is not unemployment. And so that is a misconception.
And common sense would suggest that those people that were drawing unemployment, they didn't quit their jobs. Most likely, they were probably furloughed from their jobs. So they're not quitting. They're just not necessarily looking for something else in that pay range, maybe.
Well, right. But I think we're talking about people who quit specifically. Yeah. The unemployment, mixing these two things together, I think is just a little irresponsible, because when you have people who are quitting versus people who are let go, that's completely different. You're not mixing those numbers. That's two different things. So yeah, this is a big misconception. There's a couple other things I kind of wanted to mention about this. Like, there's this unbelievable report by EY titled "The Antidote to the Great Resignation." We'll put it in the show notes, hopefully. But I strongly encourage people to take a look at this. If you want to look at kind of like, if you're a small business, even if you're an employee and you want to understand like, well, how do companies fight this Great Resignation? If you're a recruiter or whatever, the one stat that they put in there is crazy. Is like over 40% of employees across the whole globe in all multiple industries are considering leaving their jobs. So that doesn't have anything to do with like unemployment. That's a global number. You know, that's not a US centric number. That's just people thinking about leaving because of their things. And in this report, the top 3 reasons why people leave their jobs. 54% said they don't feel valued by their organizations. 52% said, or their manager. And then like 51% of employees feel like that they don't have a sense of belonging. And that's it. They're talking about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They're talking about, you know, the bottom 2 needs, which are, you know, on the bottom, I'm doing my hand for people who are listening, but you know, the triangle thing, you have the bottom, you have the psychological and the safety. And that's what VPs have been really focusing on: the paycheck, the food, the clothing. But now employees want more. They want that love and that belonging, that social belonging. You know, they want that piece. So now the employers who focus on, you know, those areas are going to be much more competitive in the market. So yeah, the Great Resignation, it's not about unemployment. It's not about people being lazy. People are looking at their situations and saying, I want to be happier. I want flexibility. I want purpose. I want belonging. I want a sense. I'm just not a number. And, you know, I think the pandemic has highlighted it.
We have one more question here that's tax related. I'm not going to share it. But those tax questions are so tricky because there's legal requirements, and if we give the wrong advice to somebody, we'll end up in trouble. So instead of sharing that question, I'm just going to say I will try really hard at some point in this series we're doing on the future of work to find somebody that can come in and address some of those legal and tax issues that for us. So
yeah,
I hope that helps. Look out for that.
I could help you. I could help you out with that too.
Okay. I appreciate that. That would be a fun program to do.
Yeah, I mean, fun if you like taxes. Well. But just to let you know that if you're a company, just some resources. There are what they call PEOs out there right now. And if you're a company looking to hire people in different countries, there are so many different tax rules and laws if you're talking about hiring people in different countries, even different states. And you can hire, there's a company called Remote, actually, and they're one of the largest PEOs. You know, if you want to hire people, like even if your people want to be digital nomads, for example, you have a company and someone says, hey, you know what? I want to live in Greenland for the next 2 years. I can be fully remote. Well, there's things that you have to do as a company to allow that to happen. Remote, the company remote.com can help you with that thing. And they're pretty big. They've gotten a lot of funding in a lot of newspapers. So just a little resource for you.
Thank you. So we're almost done with our hour here. I want to finish up with this. What's the next frontier in this movement? Where do we go from here?
I think fully remote. I think hybrid remote. I think hybrid remote right now is what most businesses are going to probably go with, because I think they see it as kind of a happy medium. And it kind of makes sense, theoretically. Oh, well, people are lonely, because there are downsides to remote work. Isolation, loneliness, sometimes collaboration and innovation can sometimes be a little bit difficult. So there are reasons to get together. But what I believe is the next wave is that hybrid remote will be kind of like the Band-Aid. And then people will ask the question, well, because we always want more as a species. Well, why am I coming into the office twice a week for no reason? And then the question will be, what is the next usage for these skyscrapers and office buildings? To me, that's the biggest fascination I have. What's going to happen in New York City? What's going to happen to Atlanta, downtown? What are these skyscrapers going to be in 25 years? That is, to me, yeah.
That's a good opportunity to plug our next program in this series, actually. In January, we'll be in conversation with the guys from Pro Athlete. It's a fantastic Kansas City company, but one of the things that they've done since the pandemic has waned is they are 3 days a week. You are required to work remotely. You cannot come into the office more than 2 days a week. And then every employee has the option to come in 2 days a week. You can be home all 5 days, or you can come in up to 2 days a week. And I think that's a great model for people.
Right. But why have the office building? That's going to be, like at some point that company will say like, well, is it worth paying this amount of money for the building? So to me, that's like really trying to understand where our next professional gathering spaces. I love this idea of co-living, I think is really big. Community co-working space is a company called Cody. I'll give a shout out. I think that's getting big, like where people are purchasing homes in the middle of communities and turning that home into kind of like a co-working spot. So it's a local neighborhood, more of a neighborhood co-working spot where you can go to a house and just work there versus your own home. So,
or maybe some of these giant campuses become a series of meeting spaces that companies can lease. It's just a room.
Right. So. I think I believe that's what Google has started doing, is leasing their campus space. So.
Well, Kaleem, I'm sorry, we only got through about half of my questions. We'll have to have you back again. Maybe at the end of the series, we can do the other half.
Why not? Maybe you can bring all of us back and we have a panel.
That'd be fun. Cool. Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. This was great, and we appreciate you doing it, Kaleem.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Good night, everybody.